The kind of storm that swallows whole towns had rolled into Cedar Ridge without warning, turning the streets into a white blur and the sky into something that felt too close, too heavy. Inside Snow Haven Animal Rescue, the wind rattled the windows hard enough that Jake Walker kept glancing toward the frames, as if measuring whether they would hold. He didn't usually work nights anymore, but the volunteer scheduled for the shift never made it in, and Jake wasn't the type to leave animals alone in a blizzard. He moved through the dim lobby with a quiet, disciplined rhythm, the kind a man kept long after the battlefield was gone. Every breath made his ribs ache in that familiar old way, though tonight he tried not to think about why. The storm howled, the lights flickered. Jake barely reacted. Silence and danger were old companions. Then, without warning, headlights cut across the drifting snow outside. Tires skidded. A car door slammed. A shadow staggered toward the entrance. Sarah McKinney burst through the door so violently that snow followed her inside. Her firefighter jacket was half unzipped, hair soaked, breath ragged. Jake caught the door before the wind ripped it off. What happened? She thrust a bundled shape into his arms, voice breaking with urgency. Found him by the East Highway. He wasn't moving. I thought he was gone. The weight was barely there. A puppy. A German shepherd. Ice clung to his fur like claws. Jake didn't pause. He pushed through the hallway toward the small exam room, flipping on the heat lamp with a practiced flick. When he laid the pup on the cold metal table, the jolt of his own memory hit him so hard he almost swayed. Another shepherd. Another night. Another life slipping away. Not now. Not again. He wrapped the pup in a clean towel and began rubbing fast, forcing warmth into numb limbs. Sarah hovered nearby, breath trembling. He's so cold, Jake. Too cold. He didn't answer. He leaned close, listening for breath he wasn't. Certain would come. It came. Barely. A fragile flutter. Jake steadied his voice. He's fighting. That's enough. He pressed 2 fingers to the pup's chest, feeling the stuttering heartbeat, the way life sometimes clings even when everything else has given up. He adjusted the heat lamp, his motions sharp and controlled, but his eyes softer than he realized. The pup twitched, legs jerking weakly like he was still trying to run from something that terrified him. Jake slowed his hands, lowering his tone to something gentle. Easy, kid. Easy. You're here now. Sarah exhaled shakily, wiping her face. How do you always sound so sure Jake didn't answer because he wasn't? He watched the pup's ribs rise, fall, stall, then catch again. Minutes stretched. The storm roared. At last the pup's eyelids fluttered. Once. Twice. Then he opened them. Amber. Too bright for a creature on the edge of dying. The moment those eyes found Jake, the tremor in Jake's chest wasn't from the cold. Sarah whispered, He sees you. It didn't feel like seeing. It felt like recognition. Impossible. Wrong. And yet. Jake swallowed hard. That look lived somewhere deep in his memory. The same look Ranger had given him before the helicopter took off, before the gunfire drowned everything else out, before silence became a punishment Jake carried everywhere. The pup tried lifting his head. His jaw quivered. His mouth opened just a fraction. Jake leaned forward instinctively. And then it happened. A sound escaped the tiny body. Not a cry, not a whine. Something shaped. Intentional. A small, broken syllable that rose, caught, and pushed its way into the air like it had meaning. It froze Jake in place. Sarah snapped her head up. Did he just... Jake held up a hand. He didn't breathe. The pup's mouth moved again. A whisper of sound came out. Soft, strained, almost a word. Something Jake's brain wanted to recognize, even though he knew it couldn't be real. The storm outside went silent for half a breath. Jake stepped back, pulse pounding with a strange mix of fear and déjà vu. He knew this sensation, this cold drifting in the spine, this impossible echo of something he'd buried 6 years ago. Sarah looked between Jake and the pup. "Jake, what was that?" He didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, he turned back to the table, hands steadying themselves on the metal edge. The pup shivered, shrinking into the towel, eyes still locked on Jake as if waiting for something from him. Permission, safety, recognition. Jake didn't know, but he felt it. A pull, familiar, unwanted, and yet unavoidable. Sarah whispered again, voice small. "Is he going to make it?" Jake's voice came out low. "Tired and scarred. If he wants to live, he will." They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. By morning, the storm had settled into a low growl outside the shelter walls. Inside, the heat lamps hummed, weak but steady. Jake Walker stood over the metal table, arms folded, jaw locked, staring down at the little shepherd pup he'd somehow kept alive through the night. The dog was awake now. Barely, but awake, and watching him. Not in the curious, clumsy way most puppies watched people. No. This one stared like he was waiting for something Jake hadn't agreed to give. Jake looked away. He didn't want this, any of it. He'd come to Snowhaven to disappear, not to be pulled into another bond he couldn't afford to lose. Not after Ranger, not after watching a dog who trusted him more than anything bleed out in a desert he still dreamed about. Sarah McKinney walked in quietly, brushing melted snow from her sleeves. She saw Jake stiffen, saw the way he refused to meet the pup's gaze, and something in her softened. "You okay?" Jake kept his eyes on the counter. He busied himself with a stack of medical gloves that didn't need reorganizing. "Fine. You sure? Because last night looked like more than just a rescue." Jake didn't answer. Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He keeps staring at you, like he knows you saved him." Jake snorted under his breath. "He doesn't know a damn thing. He's a dog." But even as he said it, Remy let out a small sound. Not a whine, not a cry. A soft, breathy tone that made Jake's shoulders tense. Sarah blinked. "See," she said gently. "He's trying to connect." Jake shut his eyes for a second. A long, controlled second. Then he turned away, walking toward the supply closet like distance could erase what he'd heard. "He doesn't need me. He just needs heat and food. Anyone can do that." Sarah didn't buy it. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, studying him the way people who've known grief sometimes recognize it in others. "You ever think maybe he came to the wrong person if you plan on pretending you don't care?" Jake froze. Her words hit deeper than she knew. Pretending was how he survived. Pretending the missions hadn't stained every corner of him. Pretending Kandahar hadn't carved out something he never got back. Pretending Ranger's last breath wasn't still echoing in him. That echo came back now, a memory sharp as broken glass. Ranger lying in the dust, legs twitching, eyes locked onto Jake. His mouth opening just slightly. A sound escaping him that wasn't a bark, wasn't a cry, something shaped, something that still haunted Jake because he never understood it. Then silence. Jake gripped the counter so hard his knuckles whitened. Behind him, Remy shifted. Jake could feel the pup's eyes on him, steady and patient, like he wasn't in a shelter but in that desert again, with another shepherd trying to tell him something he didn't want to hear. Sarah cleared her throat softly. "You don't have to talk about what happened. I'm not." "Right." She hesitated. "You're just standing there like somebody ripped open an old scar." Jake shot her a look, but he didn't deny it. Sarah stepped toward the table and touched the pup's head gently. "You know, maybe he chose you." Jake's voice sharpened. "Don't start with that. Why not? Because that's not how this works. How do you think it works, then?" Jake exhaled hard through his nose. Dogs don't choose. They adapt. They survive. Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Remy made another sound. A soft, deliberate tone. Almost questioning. Jake's chest tightened. He hated how his body reacted before his mind could stop it. Hated how that tiny noise reached a place in him he'd buried under 6 years of silence. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Jake. That didn't sound random. He forced himself to walk past the table, forced himself not to look at the pup. I'm going downstairs to reset the breaker. Sarah watched him go, shaking her head, not angry, just sad. She looked back at the pup, who still hadn't stopped staring at the door Jake disappeared through. She whispered, almost like she was speaking for him. He's scared to hope again, little one. That's all. Remy blinked slowly, then settled his chin on the towel, eyes fixed on the hallway Jake had taken. Waiting. Jake might have walked away from the exam table, but he couldn't shake the feeling of those bright amber eyes tracking him, calling him. He tried focusing on the breaker panel in the storage room, but his mind replayed that last moment with Ranger. The sound that wasn't a word, but felt like one. The way Ranger had still been trying to reach him even as the world went dark. Ranger had waited for him, and Jake had never forgiven himself for not getting there fast enough. Now here was another shepherd. Small, fragile, somehow familiar, making sounds he shouldn't make. Jake pressed a hand against his face. Damn it, not again, not this time. But when he walked back upstairs, Remy lifted his head, ears perking the moment he sensed Jake's footsteps. Those amber eyes locked onto him with a kind of quiet insistence. Jake felt his chest tighten again. He tried ignoring it. He really did. But Remy didn't. Look away. He didn't blink. He just watched him with the steady patience of someone who knew something Jake didn't. Someone who was waiting. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. By late evening, the shelter had settled into that unsettling kind of quiet Jake hated. The type that made every small sound feel louder. He checked the thermostat again. Still dropping. The heater had been coughing all afternoon, but now it gave one last sputter and died. Jake muttered under his breath, "Not tonight." He grabbed his jacket. He could go home, warm up, call Hank in the morning and fix it then. The animals would manage under the blankets. It wasn't ideal, but he'd spent years convincing himself that he didn't owe anyone more than the bare minimum. Not people, not animals, certainly not a puppy he'd met 12 hours ago. He shut the light in the exam room and turned toward the lobby. A soft thump behind him. Jake paused. Another. He turned. The fleece blanket on. The table shifted. A tiny head pushed out, eyes still groggy but searching. Remy dragged himself forward, wobbling on unsteady legs, until he reached the very edge of the table. He lifted a paw, stretching toward Jake's hand like he couldn't bear even a foot of distance between them. Jake exhaled. Kid, go to sleep. Remy didn't. He pushed again, paw brushing Jake's knuckles. Then came that sound. Hey. Barely shaped, barely audible, but real. Jake's pulse kicked. He took a step back and immediately hated himself for it. Remy froze at the loss of contact, ears flattening, small chest rising too fast from the effort of moving. The room felt colder than a broken heater could explain. Jake rubbed a hand over his face. You don't know what you're doing to me, kid. He turned toward the door again. A stronger gust of wind hit the shelter siding. The temperature dropped another degree. He could feel it in his bones, in the air touching his face. The metal tables would be freezing. In an hour. The smallest animals wouldn't last the night. He knew this. He'd seen creatures die from cold when the world stayed indifferent. Another faint sound pulled him around. This time Remy didn't reach for his hand. He climbed. Slowly. Painfully. paw over paw until he reached the edge of the table and tried to stand. His legs shook violently. He fell, caught himself, then pressed his head weakly against Jake's forearm. It was not random. It was deliberate, almost pleading. Jake whispered, voice cracking in a way he hadn't expected. "Don't do that." Remy pressed harder, small body trembling from the cold. Jake closed his eyes, fighting the instinct to shut down, to run, to avoid feeling anything he couldn't control. He tried to pull his arm back. Remy made a quick, soft sound. Not hey, something else, something that matched the panicked hitch in Jake's breath. Jake froze. It wasn't mimicking a word. It was mimicking him. The puppy was repeating the rhythm of Jake's breathing. Jake looked down, stunned. No dog should do that. No animal should listen that closely. He felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Not out of fear. Out of recognition he couldn't explain. Remy lifted his head, touching Jake's chest with surprising accuracy, as if finding the place where the breath lived. His tiny body pressed against Jake's ribs and held. Jake whispered into the stillness. "What the hell are you?" This should have made him step away. Instead, something inside him cracked. He sighed, long and tired, and rested a hand on Remy's back. "All right, you win. We stay." Remy's entire body relaxed, not like a dog, like someone who had been holding on for dear life and finally let go. His head tucked neatly against Jake's chest, warm breath soaking through Jake's shirt. Jake swallowed hard. "Careful now. I'm not good at this." Remy didn't move, the pup's breathing synced with Jake's again, perfectly, quietly, as if he was anchoring Jake, to the moment, to the room, to him. Jake's throat tightened. It felt too familiar. Ranger had done the same thing the night before a mission went bad. Pressed his head to Jake's chest, breathing slow, reassuring him the way only war dogs knew how. That memory slammed into him so hard he had to grip the table to steady himself. But Remy wasn't Ranger. And yet, in the cold silence of Snowhaven, that tiny heartbeat against him felt like a second chance he didn't ask for and wasn't sure he deserved. Jake whispered again, softer this time. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." Remy shifted, pushing himself even closer as if sealing that promise. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat beside the exam table with the pup curled against him, the storm clawing at the walls. A small decision. Stay one night. Warm the animals. Keep the pup from freezing. But deep inside, Jake felt something he didn't want to name settle into place. He'd taken one step toward a bond he'd sworn to never feel again. And the pup? The pup seemed to know it. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. Jake Walker woke before the sun, not because of the storm or the cold, but because a warm weight was pressed against his chest. Remy had curled himself there sometime during the night, breathing in slow, shallow bursts that matched Jake's rhythm almost perfectly. Jake lay still, listening. The pattern was identical. Each inhale mirrored his. Each exhale followed half a second behind, like the pup was learning him the way a soldier learned the cadence of his team. It shouldn't have meant anything. It shouldn't have pulled anything loose inside him. But it did. Jake shut his eyes, and the past rose like it had only been waiting. The thumping of rotor blades, hard and fast, wind slapping against his helmet. Ranger beside him, muscles braced, ready for the descent. Then the firefight. Shots cracking too close. Dust exploding around them. Ranger breaking formation to pull. Jake out of the choke point he never saw coming. Blood. Heat. Ranger's breathing, ragged and uneven, pressed against Jake's chest when the helicopter finally lifted them out of the kill zone. That last sound Ranger made. Soft. Shaped almost a word. Jake swallowed hard and forced his eyes open. Remy shifted in his sleep, nose brushing Jake's ribs. A faint hum escaped him, barely there, like he was repeating the memory without knowing it. Jake touched Remy's head gently. "You have no idea what you're stirring up, kid." Remy didn't wake, but his breathing deepened, sinking to Jake again. Something tightened in Jake's throat. He pushed himself upright carefully, easing Remy into the blanket. The pup blinked awake, stretching his legs in a clumsy arc. When he looked up, it was with that same steady, too aware gaze Jake wasn't ready for. "Morning," Jake murmured. Remy made a low sound. Not mimicry, more like acknowledgement. Jake opened a can of food at the counter. His hands weren't shaking, but they wanted to. He spoke without looking back. "You know, most dogs your age don't act like this. They're loud. They chew things. They don't watch people like they've known them before." Silence. Then from behind him, a soft hum. Not random, not playful. It matched the tone Jake had just used. Jake turned slowly. Remy sat with one paw lifted, as if waiting to see if he'd done something right. Jake blinked. That was close. Remy lowered his paw, ears tilting forward, waiting. Jake set the bowl down. "You're going to make my life complicated, aren't you?" Another hum. A little higher this time. Jake felt something crack quietly inside him. He sat on the floor beside Remy and let the pup crawl into his lap. He didn't fight it. "Not this morning. You don't understand me, kid. You're just copying sounds." Remy nudged his chin beneath Jake's hand. Jake breathed out. "Fine. Maybe you understand a little." He fed the pup from his palm, slow and steady. Remy ate, but his eyes never drifted from Jake's face. It should have been unnerving. Instead, it felt like a conversation Jake didn't have to force. Sarah arrived mid-morning with a thermos of coffee. The moment she stepped inside, she froze. Jake was sitting on the floor, Remy sprawled across his lap like he'd lived there his entire life. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Well, this is new." Jake shot her a look. "Don't start. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to." She handed him the coffee. He took it, careful not to shift Remy. Sarah watched for a moment, her voice softening. "You talk to him now." Jake didn't respond. Sarah tilted her head. "What's that about?" Jake hesitated, then said quietly, "He listens. All dogs listen, not like this one." Remy chose that moment to make a low, melodic murmur, the exact rise and fall of Jake's previous sentence. Sarah's mouth fell open. "Okay, that's not normal." Jake looked away. "Yeah, I know." Sarah crouched near them. "Does it bother you?" Jake rubbed his thumb along Remy's back, feeling each tiny breath. It should. He's picking up things he shouldn't, things that feel familiar. Sarah's eyes softened with concern. "Jake, what is this really about?" Jake didn't want to say it. The words felt like stepping onto unstable ground. Ranger did this too. Sarah stilled. "The war dog you lost in Kandahar." Jake nodded, jaw tightening. "Before missions, before the last day." He'd press his head here, right on my chest, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. And the night he died, he made a sound. The closest thing to a word I ever heard from a dog. Sarah's voice fell to a whisper. "What did it sound like?" Jake closed his eyes briefly. "Like goodbye." A quiet breath escaped Sarah's lips. "Jake, I'm sorry." Jake shook his head. "Don't pity me. Just understand why I can't let myself get pulled in again." But Remy nudged his chin upward, forcing Jake to look at him. The pup's eyes were bright, steady, impossibly grounded for something so small. Sarah almost smiled. "Looks like he didn't get that memo." Jake sighed. I noticed. Outside, the storm had stopped, but frost clung to the windows in stubborn sheets. The roads were clearing, but everything still felt frozen, suspended. A season between endings and beginnings. Jake felt the same. He got up only long enough to grab a sandwich from the counter. When he returned, Remy followed, matching every step like a shadow. Jake broke off a small piece of bread. "Don't get needy, I'm not great company." Remy rested his paw on Jake's boot and made a quiet sound, almost playful, as if disagreeing. Jake stared down at him, defeated. "Fine, you can disagree." When Jake took a bite, Remy widened his eyes and made a faint questioning hum. Jake shook his head. "We're really doing this, huh? Eating breakfast together like some kind of team." Remy hummed back, higher this time, matching Jake's rhythm again. Jake froze mid-chew. That one hit too close. He looked down slowly. Remy was still watching him, still sinking him, still waiting for something Jake wasn't sure he could give. Jake whispered, voice low and honest. "I don't know what you want from me, kid." Remy stepped forward, pressed his small body against Jake's knee, and exhaled in perfect time with him. Jake felt the breath like a memory returning from the dark. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but inside him, the ice hadn't melted yet. Not fully. Not yet. A D-Gold zone, they thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. The first rumor slipped through Cedar Ridge like a spark on dry grass. A pup at Snowhaven could almost talk. By noon the next day, people were already drifting in. Some came with genuine curiosity, some with their phones ready, hoping to catch something they could post online. Jake felt the shift the moment he walked into the lobby. Too many eyes. Too much noise. Remy sat close to his boots, alert but unsure, his ears twitching at every whisper. A woman in a parka leaned in. "Is that him?" A teenager lifted his phone. "Dude, say it again. Make him say it." Jake stepped forward. "He's not a trick. He's recovering. Please give him space." Most people backed off politely. Most. By late afternoon, a group of high school boys pushed inside, laughing too loud for a shelter filled with anxious animals. "There he is," one of them said, pointing at Remy. "The talking dog. Bet he sounds like Siri on a bad day." They crowded too close, phones angled at Remy's face. One boy made kissing noises. Another snapped his fingers at Remy like he was calling a stray cat. The pup tried to back up, but his tail hit the wall. His body lowered, ears flattened. A trembling whine slipped out. Jake felt something inside him snap. "Back away from him. Now." The boys laughed, thinking he was overreacting. One raised his phone even closer. "Come on, little guy. Say something." "That was it. I said move." The volume in Jake's voice startled everyone. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to cut the room in half. The kind of tone that came from years of command, the kind that made Marines stop mid-sentence. The boys froze. Jake pointed at the door. "Out. You can't just kick us out." One muttered. Sarah entered from the hallway at the worst possible moment, saw the tension, and didn't hesitate. "Out means out. Go." The boys exchanged looks, then shuffled out, muttering but obeying. The door shut behind them with a dull thud. Silence settled. Heavy. Charged. Jake stood still, chest rising and falling faster than he meant to show. He hadn't raised his voice like that in years. Not since the desert. Not since he'd lost Ranger. Sarah looked at him carefully. "You all right?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "He's not entertainment. No one said he was. They treated him like a circus act. Because they don't understand him the way you do." Jake shook his head, jaw tightening. He doesn't need this. He doesn't need people poking and filming and scaring him. Sarah stepped closer. "You're not wrong. But be honest. This is about more than the boys." Jake didn't answer. She held his gaze. "You have the right to protect something that gives you hope again." The words landed harder than she intended. Jake looked away, but not fast enough to hide the sting of truth. Hope felt dangerous. Hope had a cost. Sarah's voice softened. You're allowed to choose what's best for him, even if it scares you. Jake exhaled slowly. So what's the choice? Sarah motioned toward the windows where people still lingered outside. Hide him, keep him away from the world, or let him be what he already is. A reminder that good things still happen. Jake looked down at Remy. The pup watched him with that quiet steadiness he was beginning to recognize too well. The choice wasn't simple. Keeping Remy hidden would be safer, easier, a way to protect him from people who didn't understand. But Snowhaven needed something to stir, the town back to kindness. And Jake needed to remember what it felt like to believe in something that wasn't going to vanish. Jake crouched. Remy stepped forward immediately, resting a paw on his knee. Kid, what do you want? Remy blinked. Then, to Jake's shock, the pup turned and walked straight toward the entrance lobby, where a small group of kids waited with their mother. Remy approached slowly, careful but brave. The youngest girl knelt. Hi. Remy tilted his head and said it back. Hi. The girl gasped, then burst into the purest kind of laughter, the kind that spread quickly, pulling her siblings into it. Jake felt the sound hit him somewhere deep. Not painful. Not this time. Warm, Sarah whispered beside him. That's your answer. Jake didn't speak. He watched as the mother's eyes softened, as the children gently stroked Remy's back, as the pup leaned in but never looked away from Jake, waiting for approval. Jake finally nodded, quiet and slow. All right, but on our terms. Remy gave a soft hum, one Jake felt more than heard. Sarah placed a hand on Jake's arm. Protecting something fragile doesn't make you weak, Jake. It makes you whole. Jake didn't reply, but he knew she was right. Leaving had always been easy. Walking away from attachments, from people, from memories. Easy, expected, safe. But staying, choosing to protect something delicate, that was harder. And Jake Walker had never been the kind of man who chose the easy path. He looked at Remy, surrounded now by gentle hands and bright laughter, and felt something shift. Maybe protecting hope could be its own kind of justice. Quiet, unseen, but real. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. Jake didn't remember falling asleep on the cot in the back room. He only remembered the sudden weight on his chest, the sharp nudge under his jaw, and the soft, urgent sound Remy made. Not a cry. Not fear. A call. Remy backed up, paws scraping the floor, looking from Jake to the door as if every second mattered. Jake sat up, heart kicking into gear. What is it? What's wrong? Remy whined again, more insistent now, then bolted toward the exit. Jake grabbed his boots and followed, not thinking, just reacting the way he once did when a partner sensed danger before he did. The cold slammed into them the moment he opened the door. Remy didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the yard toward the fence line, stopping abruptly and scratching at the snow-covered corner. Jake jogged after him. What are you trying to show me? Then he heard it. A sound faint enough that any normal person would have dismissed it as wind. But Remy wasn't normal, and neither was the noise. A thin, trembling bleat. Weak, dying. Jake's breath caught. He dropped to his knees, sweeping snow aside with his hands until he uncovered a baby deer wedged against the fence. Its body shook violently, eyes glazed with the kind of fear that made every instinct in Jake sharpen. Remy pressed himself. Beside the fawn, almost shoulder to shoulder, trembling from the cold, but refusing to move. Jake murmured, "You found her." The deer's breathing faltered. Jake didn't hesitate. He stripped off his jacket, wrapped it around the small body, and lifted the fawn gently. Its legs dangled weightless against his arms. Remy followed step for step, matching Jake's pace like a soldier rejoining formation. Inside the shelter, Jake knelt beside the heat vent, working fast. Careful pressure, warm cloth, slow breathing. He'd done battlefield stabilization 100 times, but this hit different. The fawn wasn't bleeding. She wasn't injured. She was giving up. Remy refused to leave her side. He pressed his nose against the fawn's neck, letting out a soft rhythm of quiet hums. His own body shook, but he stayed there, anchoring her with what little warmth he had. Jake watched them, chest tightening. He remembered the desert again. Ranger turning his head towards something the rest of the squad hadn't heard. Ranger pulling Jake away seconds before the explosion. Dogs heard danger. They heard pain. They heard what humans ignored until it was too late. Jake looked at Remy with new clarity. You didn't guess she was out there. You heard her. Through the snow. Through the storm. Through everything. Remy didn't look up. He kept humming, soft and steady. The fawn blinked weakly, then nudged her head toward Remy's muzzle. Jake exhaled in disbelief. You brought me to her. You knew. Something inside him cracked wide open. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't luck. It was a reminder. A whisper of the promise he never fulfilled. The duty he walked away from after Ranger died. Protecting what was fragile. Saving what couldn't save itself. Jake touched Remy's back, feeling the tremors from cold and exhaustion. You're telling me something, aren't you? Remy leaned into his hand, finally looking up. His eyes weren't pleading. They weren't afraid. They were steady, and they knew him. Jake's voice broke. I swore I wouldn't do this again. Remy placed a paw on Jake's knee. Jake's breath hitched. He hadn't cried in years, not when Ranger fell, not when the mission reports came back incomplete, not when people thanked him for service that had cost him more than he'd ever admit. But now, with a trembling pup and a newborn deer pressed against his jacket, something inside him gave way. The tears came quietly, with no shame, no fight. Jake pulled Remy into his arms, his voice shaking. I hear you. I hear what you're saying. Remy pressed his head to Jake's chest, sinking his breath to Jake's again, that strange, instinctive connection that defied explanation. Jake held him tighter. I'm not done. I get it now. I'm not finished. The truth wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a debt, a vow Jake had abandoned when the world broke him, a vow Remy somehow found and placed back into his hands. Save what's fragile. Protect what's fading. Stand where life is thinnest. Jake whispered into Remy's fur, voice raw. I won't fail this time. Remy breathed with him, in perfect rhythm. The fawn's heartbeat steadied, and in the quiet that followed, Jake Walker, once certain he had nothing left to give, finally understood. Remy wasn't a miracle sent to amaze the world. He was a promise sent to repair one man. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. The story of the rescued fawn spread through Cedar Ridge faster than Jake expected. Not because anyone bragged, and certainly not because he wanted attention. It moved quietly, the way good things sometimes do in small towns, passed in grocery lines, whispered over fence posts, mentioned during Sunday coffee. People didn't come to congratulate him. They came because something about it made them remember who they used to be. By the end of the week, Snowhaven had a stack of envelopes on the counter. Checks, small bills, cards with shaky handwriting. Someone taped a jar near the front door with a hand-drawn label from a child. For Remy and the ones he helps. Jake stared at it in disbelief. He'd spent 6 years slipping through life like a shadow, unnoticed, untouched. But this was the town saying, "We see you." Martha was the first to comment. "Looks like folks finally remembered this place matters," she said, blinking fast behind her oversized glasses. Then she nudged Jake with her elbow. Or maybe they just remembered you do. Jake muttered something non-committal, but Remy, sitting beside him, lifted a paw and tapped Jake's boot as if seconding the opinion. By afternoon, people began stopping by. Not for spectacle, not to film Remy, but to help. A retired carpenter patched the broken kennel door. A teenage boy shoveled the walkway without being asked. A woman brought warm blankets she'd sewn herself. Quiet justice wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about setting something back where it belonged. Jake didn't fully understand that until the woman in the grey beanie walked into Snowhaven just before sunset. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding a small collar in her hands. Her eyes were red, but she smiled when Remy trotted toward her and sat politely at her feet. Jake approached slowly. "Can I help you?" She ran her fingers along Remy's ears, her voice steady but soft. "My daughter had a dog. Golden retriever mix, sweetest thing on earth. We lost him in November. Cancer." Jake nodded gently. She looked up at him, her expression warm, not searching, not grieving, just grateful. "I heard what you did. For that little dear, for this pup, for the town." Jake shook his head. "Remy did most of it." "Maybe," she said. "But someone taught him it was safe to care." Remy leaned into Jake's leg. Jake swallowed hard. The woman took a breath before adding something that landed deeper than she could have known. "My daughter always said the world still had good men in it, that God leaves. Signs, little ones, hidden in the cold places. Things like the way a dog looks at you when you're hurting, or the way a stranger does the right thing when no one's watching." She placed the collar on the counter and stepped back. "What you did, it's one of those signs. It reminded me she might have been right." Jake's throat tightened. He'd heard praise before, loud, official, pinned to uniforms and written in reports. None of it ever felt like this. This wasn't applause. This was acknowledgement. Quiet, honest, and earned. "Thank you," Jake said, voice low. "I don't really know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing." She gave Remy one last scratch and walked out, leaving the small collar behind like a blessing. Jake stood in place long after she was gone. Remy nudged his hand gently, sensing the shift inside him. Jake whispered, barely audible, "They saw it, buddy. They saw the good in what we did." Remy tilted his head, then pressed his forehead to Jake's knee, the same way he did the first night they met. Jake rested a hand on the pup's back. For years he'd believed justice meant punishment, closure, the clean strike of consequence. But here, surrounded by kindness, by community, by a world choosing to do a little better because of a single act, he realized justice could be as simple as this. When the right thing is finally recognized, when a broken man is quietly invited back into the world, when a dog who should have died in the snow becomes a reason people believe, again, justice wasn't something delivered. It was something restored. Jake exhaled, slow and steady, like releasing a weight he'd carried too long. Maybe Ranger wasn't asking for goodbye 6 years ago. Maybe he'd been asking Jake not to stop being who he was. Jake looked down at Remy, who was waiting patiently, as if he'd been waiting forever. "Come on, kid," he murmured. "Let's keep going." Remy wagged his tail, and for the first time since the desert, Jake felt certain he was exactly where he was meant to stand. Healing visual. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. Spring didn't arrive in Cedar Ridge with bright colors or warm breezes. It slipped in quietly, the way healing often does, slow, patient, almost shy. The kind of change you only notice when you stop bracing for the next storm. 3 months passed. Remy grew first. His legs lengthened, his coat thickened, his gait turned confident. He ran with a purpose now, carving long arcs across the shelter yard as if the snowmelt itself was pulling him forward. but he always circled back, checking on Jake with that same steady amber gaze, the same promise he'd made since the night the world almost lost him. Jake grew next, not physically, but in the ways that mattered. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they came less often, and when they did, he woke to a soft paw tapping his arm instead of the suffocating silence he'd lived with for years. He didn't sit alone at the edge of his bed anymore. Instead, mornings began with Remy's clumsy attempts at greeting him, sometimes a half-formed sound, sometimes just a head pressed firmly against Jake's chest like an anchor. Jake actually smiled one morning, a small, cautious curve of the mouth, but a real one. Martha nearly dropped her coffee when she saw it. Sarah noticed the changes too. Her visits to Snowhaven had turned into routine. Some days she brought supplies, some days just conversation, but most days she stayed because she genuinely wanted to. They repaired kennels together, shared late dinners of leftover chili, sat on the back steps watching the mountains soften as winter retreated. Once, while they were replacing a broken latch, Sarah said, "You know, you're easier to talk to when you're not hiding behind walls made of barbed wire." Jake grunted. "This is me being easy." Sarah laughed. "Then heaven help the version that isn't." She didn't push for more. She didn't need to. Healing wasn't her job. It was Jake's. All she did was stand close enough that he remembered how to let someone in. And then there was the town. Cedar Ridge had always been quiet, steady, predictable, but the story of Remy, the pup who saved a fawn, who pulled a grieving woman back into belief, who somehow gave the town a sense of purpose, sparked something. The people wanted to give back, so they created Hope Day. Not a parade, not a festival, no loudspeakers or speeches, just a simple gathering in the town square where neighbors donated pet food, blankets, and small bills folded into glass jars for Snowhaven. The local bakery made dog-shaped cookies. Kids wore paper ears and tails they'd made in school. An older man carved a wooden sign for the shelter, hand steady despite decades of arthritis. "Healing looks like celebration," Sarah whispered as she watched Remy trot proudly between groups of children. Jake shook his head lightly. "Looks like chaos," but there was softness in his voice, the kind that hadn't existed months before. Later, Jake stood with Sarah on the edge of the crowd. Remy bounded through a patch of slush, skidding into Jake's leg and sending dirty snow everywhere. Kids laughed. Jake pretended to scold him. Sarah covered her smile behind her glove. Jake didn't realize it immediately, but something in him loosened at the sight. A weight he'd carried since Kandahar, shame, guilt, loneliness, cracked just a little. And then it happened again the next day, and the next. Healing didn't announce itself. It didn't break down doors or erase the past. It appeared in small, almost invisible ways. Remy running through snow that no longer threatened to freeze him. Jake eating lunch beside Sarah without feeling the urge to retreat. The shelter operating with steady hands and warmer hearts. The town gathering not for tragedy but for hope. No one said the words out loud, but everyone felt it. Winter had broken. Life was returning. And somewhere in the middle of it, Jake Walker finally understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. Some souls aren't lost forever. Some just wait, quietly, patiently, until the world is warm enough to welcome them back. Remy nudged Jake's hand gently. Jake didn't pull away this time. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. The invitation arrived on a folded sheet of paper, delivered by a volunteer from Cedar Ridge Elementary, who looked more nervous than a person delivering good news should. She held it out to Jake like it might disappear if she gripped it too tightly. "We're hosting a unit called Listening to the World," she explained. "The kids asked if Remy could come, and maybe you too." Jake stared at the paper a moment too long. Crowds were not his thing, classrooms even less so. He opened his mouth to decline politely, but Remy padded over and pressed a paw to his boot. Not a tap. "Hold," Jake exhaled through his nose. "You're not helping," he muttered. The teacher's face lit. "So, that's a yes." Remy looked up at Jake again, eyes steady, soft, patient. Jake swallowed. "Yeah, I guess it is." The school smelled like crayons, floor polish, and the nervous excitement of children trying to sit still. The principal greeted them, wide-eyed when Remy responded to her hello with a low, melodic hum that made half the hallway gasp. Inside the classroom, 20 fourth graders sat cross-legged on a rug, bouncing with anticipation. Sarah had come too. She said the school needed crowd support, but Jake suspected she didn't trust him not to bolt. The teacher clapped her hands. "Everyone, this is Mr. Walker, and Remy." A forest of hands shot up. Someone whispered, "He looks like the dog from the newspaper." Another added, "My grandpa said he saved a deer." A third whispered, "Do you think he can actually talk?" Jake almost stepped back, but Remy nudged his leg gently, grounding him. Jake cleared his throat. "Your teacher wanted me to talk about listening. Not the kind you do with your ears, the kind you do with your heart." 20 heads tilted, rapt. Jake continued slowly. "Remy doesn't speak like we do, but he hears things. Pain, fear, loneliness. Things most people ignore. He listens to the world the way I used to listen to my team. And that kind of listening, it saves lives." A small girl raised her hand without waiting to be called. "Is that how he found the baby deer?" Jake nodded. "He heard what none of us could." Another kid. "How do we learn to listen like that?" Jake paused. It wasn't the question he expected. "You pay attention," he said quietly. "When someone's hurting, even if they don't say it out loud, you stop assuming you know everything. You notice small things, like someone whispering for help, or a pup trying to stand even when he's frozen." Remy leaned forward, touching Jake's boot again. The kids gasped when he let out a soft sound, a gentle vowel shaped like an agreement. One boy clutched his chest. "He answered you!" Jake almost smiled. He does that sometimes. The class ended with Remy letting kids pet him one at a time. Some whispered secrets into his fur, things they didn't dare say to adults. Remy closed his eyes each time, calm, steady, receiving every word. Afterward, the teacher caught Jake at the door. "They needed this," she said softly. "More than you know." Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. Word spread. First through the school, then through the small community church on Maple Street, where a retired pastor shared the story during Sunday fellowship. Then through the Cedar Ridge Veterans Group, men and women who had carried silence heavier than Jake's. At the VFW hall, an older Marine named Colton Hayes shook Jake's hand with a grip that trembled. "Your dog reminded us. We're not broken," he said, voice thick. "Just waiting for someone to hear us again." Jake stood still, throat tight. Colton wasn't talking about Remy. Not really. Messages began arriving at the shelter. Letters, small drawings from kids, notes taped to the donation bin. None mentioned miracles. None mentioned talking dogs. Instead, they said things like, "I'm trying to listen better. Thank you for reminding our town to care. I helped someone today because of your dog." Remy didn't know any of this, not in the human sense, but he sensed change the same way he sensed storms, subtle, unmistakable. He sat a little taller. He watched Jake with a patience that held history in it. One evening, Sarah stepped beside Jake as he read a letter from a veteran's wife. It said her husband slept through the night for the first time in years after hearing Remy's story. "That," Sarah whispered. That's legacy. Jake folded the letter slowly. I didn't do anything. Exactly, Sarah said. Sometimes the things that matter most happen because you didn't push them away. Jake looked down. Remy leaned against his leg once more, waiting, steady, as if he'd been beside him long before they ever met. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. They thought he was lost forever. The dog was still waiting. Night settled softly over Cedar Ridge, the kind of quiet that feels earned. A thin hush lay across the town, broken only by the crackle of the fire inside Snowhaven. Jake sat on the old rug by the hearth, legs stretched out, Remy curled against his side like he had done it his entire life. Not as a pup needing warmth, but as a companion choosing closeness. Jake's hand rested gently on Remy's head, thumb brushing the fur between his ears in slow, steady circles. He hadn't planned on staying here tonight. He hadn't planned on staying anywhere, at least not in the sense of belonging. But there he was, leaning against a warm wall, letting the firelight soften the hard edges of the room, of his memory, of himself. Remy lifted his muzzle and pressed it lightly against Jake's palm. One breath, then another. His chest rose, fell, then he made a sound. Not a bark, not a whine, a shaped, trembling murmur that trailed upward like a word trying to find its way into the world. Jake froze. Remy tried again, pushing air through his throat with effort, with intent. This time the sound came out softer, rounder, wobbling on its edges. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clear. It wasn't something that would go viral or make headlines. But it was real. Jake's breath slipped out of him, unsteady. His eyes burned in that way embarrassment tries to hide, but honesty refuses to let go of. He leaned his forehead gently against Remy's. I heard you, Jake whispered, voice rough, honest, stripped down to bone. I'll always hear you. Remy pressed closer, letting the weight of his body settle against the man who had been both broken and rebuilt by a creature barely 10 inches tall the first time they met. Outside, the wind quieted. Snowhaven glowed with soft amber light, spilling warmth across the yard, into the darkness, into places where lonely souls might still be wandering. It looked ordinary from the road, just a shelter with a flickering porch light. But inside, something sacred rested. A former seal who once carried silence like a wound. A dog who refused to let him stay, lost. 2 survivors who found each other at the exact moment the world nearly forgot them. The fire cracked again, sparks drifting upward like tiny prayers. Jake closed his eyes, not to hide from nightmares this time, but to hold on to peace. Some angels don't descend from the sky. Some arrive shivering in the snow, wrapped in a blue blanket, half frozen and half miracle. Some speak not with words but with loyalty. Some wait until the person who needs them is ready to be heard again. Remy shifted, laying his head across Jake's chest. Jake's hand moved automatically, steady and protective. A man once lost, a dog who waited, a bond that saved them both. The world outside remained cold. Inside, warmth pulsed like a heartbeat. And for the first time in a very long time, Jake believed tomorrow would be good. CTA, has a single small moment ever changed your life? Share your story with us. Sarah nodded slowly, but her eyes never left Jake. She saw something in him, a shift, a crack, something waking up behind the walls he'd carried since the desert nights and the mission nobody talked about. Jake didn't notice her staring. His gaze was locked on the pup, on the tiny body fighting the cold, on the eyes that seemed to know more than a puppy should, and on the echo of a sound he shouldn't have heard at all. When the heat lamp steadied and the pup's breaths evened, Jake finally stepped back. Just one step, enough to breathe. He wasn't sure why he whispered it. Maybe habit, Maybe instinct? You're not going anywhere tonight. The pup twitched his ears as if he understood. Outside, the wind picked up again, slamming into the side of the building like a warning. Inside, Jake Walker stared at the trembling shepherd on the metal table, sensing it deep in his bones. Something had just begun. Something he wasn't ready for. Something he couldn't walk away from. But he didn't understand it yet. Not even close.